Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance from author Indiana Wake. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. Welcome to the Carter Sisters series, a sweet and inspirational romance series where courage is tested, faith is strengthened, and love finds a way. Copyright Indiana Wake. A Baby on the Porch by Indiana Wake. Chapter 1. Figuring that the baby would not escape the box, Elizabeth laid it on the kitchen table with confidence. The kitchen was cold and the baby colder, and she knew that she would have to get some more wood on the range and a fire in the grate as soon as possible. She worked quickly, still reeling from the shock of finding an unknown baby in a box on the front porch of the ranch house. Elizabeth had never worked quite so quickly and couldn't help but wonder if she had simply become suddenly so very organized as a means of putting off, at least for a moment or two, thoughts of what she ought to do next. It seemed almost no time at all before she had the two fires burning well, and she hurriedly cleaned up her hands before approaching the kitchen table and the box containing the baby once more. Elizabeth looked into the box, almost as if she didn't really expect to see the baby there. After all, she'd had very little sleep, and it was still so early in the morning that perhaps she had just imagined the whole thing. However, when she looked into the box once more, the baby was still there, looking up at her with a slight smile and those blue eyes that captured her heart. "All right, little baby, why don't you tell me what you're doing in that box, huh?" she cooed, and the baby simply mewed in response. On closer inspection, she could see that it was really very young indeed, more than likely brand new to this world. The baby was restless, and probably would have cried if it had not been so weak. Finally, Elizabeth did what she had, in truth, been putting off from the start. She reached into the box and lifted the baby out. For a moment, she held the baby to her, and it seemed as if they both relaxed just a little. "Well, so far so good," Elizabeth said, gently rocking the baby from side to side in her arms. She had never really had much to do with babies, even though she had been the second oldest sister when their mother had died. Victoria had always been so much better at looking after people, even when they were just children themselves. And Victoria had done everything for Constance when she was a baby, even though she had only been 8 years old. Elizabeth had helped where she could, but the main care had come from Victoria. Now, as she rocked the unknown baby in her arms, she wondered what on earth she was going to do next. Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder how an 8-year-old had coped with such a thing. After a few minutes, the baby, who was clearly warming up, decided to let the world know that it was time for a feed. Quite without warning, it took in a great lungful of breath and squealed loudly. "Hey, hey," Elizabeth said, not wanting to wake the whole house. "I guess you're hungry, huh?" she whispered into the baby's ear. Elizabeth had set the baby back down into the box in order to put a little milk onto the stove to warm through. However, the baby was not at all pleased about this and, once again, squealed loudly. This time, though she rocked her and cooed and made silly faces, there seemed to be no end to the noise. "What's happening?" Suddenly, Constance was in the room. "Oh, thank heavens. Constance, just keep your eye on that milk for the moment and see it doesn't boil over," Elizabeth said, and, without any further explanation, she raced across the room to the table and picked the baby up out of the box once more. This time, however, it took so long to settle the baby down that, in minutes, the kitchen was filled with sisters. Everyone but Reed and Victoria had heard the baby complaining. "Oh, my lord, Elizabeth, where did you get that baby?" Jillian asked, her eyes wide. "He was just outside the door," Elizabeth said, shrugging as she bounced the baby up and down in her arms. "Or she was just outside the door." I don't really know which. Oh, then let's have a look, Gabriella said, seeming faintly amused. Gabriella took the baby and unpeeled several layers before confidently declaring that the child was, indeed, a little girl. As Elizabeth looked down at the little blankets the baby had been swaddled in, she could see that she had been wrapped lovingly by somebody who cared about her. Why on earth would somebody leave her there? Elizabeth said, as much to herself as to her sisters. Oh, Elizabeth, Gabriella said, her tone a mixture of care and exasperation. She'll be an unwanted baby. At least, she'll be a baby that the mama knows she can't keep. Maybe there is no daddy around. Oh, that's just too sad. How can a baby not be wanted? Elizabeth was suddenly devastated. It happens, Gabriella said, watching as her older sister rear-wrapped the baby girl. It's sad, but you know it's not uncommon. I know, I guess, Elizabeth said quietly. But I don't think I ever really thought about such things before. I mean, this is the first time I ever saw an abandoned baby with my own eyes. It's different when you see them, isn't it? I mean, it's not like somebody just told you about it and you accept that the child is taken away to an orphanage and kind of get on with your day. No, I suppose not, Gabriella said. What are you going to do? Jillian was looking over her shoulder as she washed out a small bowl with boiling water. Jillian was a very capable and practical sort of a girl who could start to help a person before they even realized they were being helped. Well, I suppose first things first, the baby needs feeding, Elizabeth said and looked from one sister to the next as she wondered how such a thing might be achieved. But I don't know how such a tiny baby is going to take milk from a spoon. Then let's find a clean cloth, Jillian said, all business. That way you can dip the cloth into the milk and the baby can suck the milk from the cloth. Simple. Oh, that's such a good idea, Constance said, obviously impressed. Right, I'll find a cloth, Jillian went on. Is the milk cool? Elizabeth asked, and felt pleased suddenly that she was surrounded by her sisters. Just moments before, she had wondered how she would manage to help the baby at all, and now that her sisters were with her, she thought she could manage to do anything. What on earth is going on? Everybody fell silent and the sisters turned as one to see Victoria, still in her nightgown, standing in the doorway staring intently at the baby. Chapter 2. That baby's mama's got to be out there somewhere, Reed said later that day when he and Victoria were alone in the kitchen. Elizabeth, who had been in the sitting room comforting the baby, silently made her way as close to the door as she could in order to listen. I have no doubt, honey, Victoria said sadly. And it sure is a shame. Not just for the baby, but for the mama. I guess the poor woman didn't think she had a choice, Reed said, and Elizabeth realized what a fine man her sister had married. There's no doubt about that. But what are we going to do? Victoria said. Well, we can't just keep the baby without saying a word. I'm gonna have to ride out to find the sheriff and let him know, if nothing else, Reed said. Maybe even now the baby's mama is changing her mind and thinking she might be able to cope with this, Victoria said hopefully. But I guess, in case she doesn't, you're right, we do need to let the sheriff know. We could be in a whole world of trouble if we just keep that baby here and said nothing. At the end of the day, it's going to be for the sheriff to decide. I mean, he might be happy for the baby to stay here for a while in the hope that the mama can be found. But he might not like that idea at all and think that the baby needs to be sent to the orphanage straight away. Either way, I guess that's where the poor little mite is going to wind up at the end of all this. I can hardly think of it, Victoria said, and Elizabeth, who was still listening intently, knew that she couldn't bear the thought of such a thing. There was no way that she could suffer the idea of the beautiful little girl going into an orphanage. She had heard so much about those places, and most of them were not good. The children had no love and nobody to cling to. This would not happen to this darling little girl. At the very moment that the baby had held tight to one of Elizabeth's fingers with her tiny, chubby hand, Elizabeth knew that she could never let her go. Not to an orphanage, at any rate. The only way she would relinquish that little girl would be into the arms of her own mama, and even then she would want reassurances that this wouldn't happen again. Of course, she knew that Reed and Victoria were only saying what needed to be said. They would have to let the sheriff know, and that was that. And yet, the idea that the sheriff might not give the baby a few days at least to wait with Elizabeth until her mama was found simply terrified her. If the sheriff came out to the ranch and took the baby away, would Elizabeth ever see her again? And would that tiny, precious girl spend the next 16 years trapped inside an orphanage, knowing all the while that she was there because nobody wanted her? Above all things, Elizabeth could not stand that. Right, well, I guess I'll ride out and speak to Sheriff Dawson, Reed said, coming to a decision, although he had sounded rather heavy-hearted about it. All right, Reed, Victoria responded equally sadly. Elizabeth knew that she had but seconds to decide the fate of the little girl in her arms. The decision was already made. Elizabeth raced into the hallway and, taking down two of the thickest shawls, she wrapped them both around herself. After all, the evenings were cool and she would need them. Some minutes after she had heard Reed riding away for the town, Elizabeth peered into the kitchen and, seeing that Victoria was not there, she hurried through. Taking half a loaf of bread and a piece of cheese, she hurriedly wrapped them and stowed them inside her shawl. While she knew what she was doing was clearly ridiculous and probably a little dangerous, still, she could not leave the baby girl to her fate, especially if that fate meant she would be taken straight to the orphanage. And at least this way Reed and Victoria would have done the right thing in the eyes of the law. They had contacted the sheriff, and any wrongdoing from that moment onward would surely be seen as Elizabeth's and Elizabeth's alone. In truth, she cared very little for that, and only that her sister and brother-in-law were safe. The moment she had made her way outside, Elizabeth began to walk quickly. She walked past the stables, deciding not to take a horse. After all, if the horse was seen, everything would be over. She would simply have to make her way across the country and see what she could find. Whatever happened, Elizabeth knew that she simply couldn't just let the baby go. From the moment she had found her on the porch, Elizabeth had known that she was her responsibility. Maybe the Lord had meant for her to find that baby, and she would do everything in her power to keep the child safe and happy until her own mama was ready to take her back. Without any true thought as to where she was going or what she would do next, Elizabeth set off into the late afternoon sunshine. Chapter 3. As Jed Tolley watched from the edge of the plains, he could hardly believe what he was seeing. Surely, the woman scampering across the fields, doing her best to keep to the cover of trees and foliage wherever she could, was Elizabeth Carter? Of course it was. He would know her anywhere, and that was the truth. After all, who on earth had made a better study of Elizabeth Carter than he had? Nobody, that was who. That day was surely the most unusual he had worked since first coming to the ranch the year before. Reed Masters had taken him on without question and had taught him more about ranching than he had known before he had arrived. He'd been a good boss to him, and Jed knew that he had much to be grateful to Reed for. News of the baby left on the porch early that morning had spread around the ranch hands like wildfire, and, before Reed had even set off for the sheriff, all his employees knew about it. Now word had it that it was Elizabeth who'd found the baby. As far as Jed was concerned, Elizabeth was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She had rich chestnut hair and sharp little blue eyes and, as far as he knew, she had not a minute's time for him. Of course, that was a great shame, since poor Jed seemed to be unable to think of anything but her. Still, he hadn't let that put him off too much and, whenever he had a chance of it, he tried to strike up a conversation with her, albeit awkwardly. Their paths crossed regularly since, being the youngest of all the ranch hands, whenever anything was needed from the stables or the barns, Jed was generally sent. Of course, as much as it had irritated him at first, once Elizabeth and her sisters had moved into the ranch house, Jed had come to see it as a blessing. It meant that he could find all manner of excuses to be near her and to speak to her. Just a few days beforehand, she had been taking down some dry laundry from the line. Jed had seen her immediately, his heart already beginning to pound. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Jed said, startling her a little. "Oh, good afternoon, Jed." She smiled at him. "I reckon you've arrived at just the right time," she said, her smile growing ever wider. Elizabeth had the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen. It was a wide smile and she had the most wonderful white teeth. If only Jed knew how to tempt her, how to make her as attracted to him as he was to her. "How so?" he asked, smiling back at her and hoping that he looked neat and tidy enough. Jed had never been self-conscious before and he knew that there was more than one girl in town who would be happy to be twirled about in his arms at the barn dance. But there was something about Elizabeth which just made him wish he was better. He didn't know in what way, he just knew that it was true. "You're just in time to help me fold this here sheet." She smiled and laughed when she saw the look on his face. "Don't go worrying that I'll tell the other ranch hands." "I wasn't thinking that at all, ma'am." "Yes, you were, I could see it on your face. You had to stop yourself looking over your shoulder to see if there was someone behind you. I reckon you men are all the same." She was clearly teasing him. In truth, he didn't know if her teasing of him was a good thing. Was she comfortable with him and did she like him? Or did she just think he was a stupid ranch hand and she was mocking him? His feelings for her were so strong that he could hardly make sense of it all. "Maybe I better just go ahead and prove it to you," Jed said, smiling and walking towards her and demonstrating his confidence. When he finally reached her, he took down the sheet and, taking 2 corners for himself, gave her the remaining 2. Without a word, he walked backward, then forwards, helping her fold the sheet perfectly. "Well, I guess you went ahead and proved it after all. I don't think I ever folded a sheet so nicely." She smiled at him and he just wished he knew what to say. If only he could think of something clever or witty, anything that would impress her. Instead, he simply grinned back at her. "Well, thank you kindly, Jed," she said, picking up the laundry basket and smiling at him before turning to make her way back indoors. "You're welcome, ma'am," he said, and tipped his broad-brimmed hat at her departing back. Jed had been kicking himself ever since, wishing he had said something, anything that would have given her the slightest indication of how he felt. But she seemed to have a curious hold over him, a hold that no other woman in Murray Plains could ever have had. And whatever it was, it seemed set to render him tongue-tied and awkward for the rest of their acquaintance. And how on earth would she ever fall in love with a man like that? If only he could be confident with her as he was with just about every other woman he ever met. But it wasn't to be. He guessed he must have really fallen for her hard to be in such a state. As he watched her making her way across the plains, there was something about the way she was hurrying and hiding that made Jed want to follow her. Not for his own purposes, but rather to be sure that she was all right. Something about her movements told him she was in trouble and he feared that she may need his help. It was a strange feeling and not entirely logical, and yet it was strong and he decided to listen to it. It wasn't until he had followed her for some distance that he realized that she was carrying something. Whatever it was, it must have been weighing her down, because when she had reached the top of a pretty steep incline, she stopped for a few minutes and steadied herself against one of the trees. From his vantage point of thick foliage, he watched and could see that she was breathing hard. She turned a little and he drew back, even though he knew she could not possibly see him. However, as she turned, he could quite clearly see that she was carrying a tiny baby. As the reality was beginning to dawn on him, Elzabeth suddenly turned and continued on her way, and it was some moments before Jed came to his senses enough to follow her once more. Chapter 4. Several times on her little journey, Elzabeth had almost turned back. In her heart, she knew what she was doing was ridiculous, if not just plain wrong. There were ways of going about things, and hers quite clearly was not one of them. However, every time she thought herself just about ready to turn around, she looked down at the tiny baby and knew that she could not. Then she would despair. What on earth was she going to do? She had nothing but bread and cheese, and she knew that the baby couldn't eat that. She had been entirely unprepared to run off in the way she had. If only she had thought to fill a water bottle with milk for her little charge. The sun was going down and Elzabeth began to feel a little afraid. Surely, by now, her family would have realized what had happened. She had been gone for more than 2 hours, striding so purposefully that she must have covered several miles. Even if she turned around at that moment, it would certainly be dark by the time she reached the ranch again. If she was going to turn back, she needed to do it straight away. However, she knew that she could not. In that moment of weakness, Elzabeth had looked all about her and, with a sigh of relief, saw a little barn just up ahead. She knew she was still on her brother-in-law's lands, but thought that she must surely now be on the very border. She hoped against hope that the barn that she was hastening towards was not on the lands that were disputed. Ever since she and her sisters had moved to the ranch, they had all been perfectly well aware that Reed was in dispute with a man called Martin Walsh over a parcel of land that seemed to sit between their two ranches. With any luck, the little barn was not on that land. When she finally reached the barn, she peered in through a great gap in the poorly maintained wooden door. It was entirely empty, save for some old straw and a few tools. Without waiting, she hurried inside. The minute she had closed the door behind them, Elzabeth wondered quite what she would do next. They had reached the safety that she had hoped for, and yet, now that it was here, she wondered quite how safe it really was. Kicking some straw into a great bundle with her foot, she sat herself down in it and laid the sleeping baby in her lap. She took out the bread and cheese and began to eat hungrily, wondering what she was going to do about the girl at her side. After all, even if she chewed the food for the baby, there was no way so tiny a child was going to be able to swallow it. It was going to be milk and nothing else, and yet she had taken herself so far away she could not imagine how she would get it. Elzabeth? At the sound of her name, Elzabeth almost screamed. She looked up desperately and stared in amazement at the form of Jed Tolley. Of all the people, she had not thought to see him there. If anybody had followed her, she would have thought it most likely to be Reed himself, or even the sheriff. "Oh no, please don't take the baby. Please don't tell the sheriff we're here," Elzabeth said, her throat tight with emotion. "No," Jed said, holding both hands out in front of him, palms forward. "Don't be afraid, ma'am, it's just me. There's nobody else out here." "But how are you here? I mean, why didn't I see you?" Elzabeth was entirely confused. "I kept myself hidden. Look, I really wouldn't have followed you if I wasn't worried. I could see that you were carrying the baby, and you are so close to Martin Walsh's land that I knew I couldn't take my eyes off you." Really, if you wandered onto his land, now that you live at the ranch, there'd be no telling what would happen. Forgive me, but I couldn't just let you get on with it. Well, thank you for caring, Elizabeth said, a little unsurely. What are you going to do now? Are going to tell Reed where I am? What? Jed looked a little confused. Do you mean to say that you ran and your family doesn't know anything about it? Jed said, and Elizabeth felt a little shiver of fear. After all, Jed was Reed Masters' employee and he was duty-bound to behave responsibly. Please, they might take the baby. Please don't tell Mr. Masters. I'm not going to tell Reed Masters where you are. I'll help you, if you like, Jed said, and she could hardly believe it. Do you really mean that, Jed? Elizabeth was so relieved she could have cried. Because I don't think that I can do this on my own. I mean it. I'm going to help you, ma'am. He smiled at her reassuringly. But do you even know what I'm asking of you? I mean, you know this baby isn't mine, right? Every instinct was telling her to accept his help regardless. However, her heart told her that this kind young man ought to have all the facts first. After all, the moment he started to help her, he would be seen as an equal part in whatever crime, if any, she was committing. I know, he said, his voice steady. That's the baby girl you found on the porch this morning. Oh, she said, surprised to find out that he seemed to know all about it. And I am going to help you, the little mite deserves a chance, he said, and smiled at her. Chapter 5. Are you all right now? Jed asked, releasing her and stepping back a little. From the moment he had declared that he would help her, Elizabeth had cried tears of relief. For some moments, he stood awkwardly, simply staring at her before realizing that she really needed comfort. Whatever had happened, whatever she had chosen to do, she was in a certain amount of shock about it. And it wasn't as if she had asked for any of it. After all, somebody else had left that child on the porch for her to find. She hadn't stolen the baby. Finally, getting over the awkwardness he always felt when he was around her, Jed sighed and took her into his arms. She almost fell against him, with the tiny baby nearly squashed between them. For a moment, he could hardly believe that he had her in his arms after wanting that very thing for so long. Of course, she was scared and sad for the baby, and it was hardly the romantic dream he had pictured. However, he would not let that stop him helping her, and, in the end, she had leaned against him in his embrace for more than 5 minutes. Yes, I'm all right now. I am so sorry, but I have been just so scared. You must think I am a terrible person for picking that baby up and running with her, but I just can't bear the idea of her going into an orphanage. An orphanage? Jed said, his eyes wide. I overheard Reed and my sister talking. And he had to go to get the sheriff, I know that. I'm not blaming Reed, but I heard him tell my sister that the sheriff might just decide that the baby had to go straight to an orphanage. And then all I could think about was what would happen to her. I mean, if her mama is never found, this baby is going to spend her life in an orphanage. Her young life, anyway. And she won't know what love is, and she'll think that nobody wants her. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears once more, and she simply let them fall. Jed, still standing close to her, reached out and gently wiped her tears away with his thumb. I understand now why you did it, ma'am. I mean, I understand why you ran off with the baby. I think it is the right thing, he said, and meant it entirely. He wasn't simply trying to impress her. The thing is, there wasn't time to think it through. There wasn't time to plan anything. I guess not, he said, looking down at the half loaf of bread and piece of cheese. I didn't even think to bring milk for the poor little thing, Elizabeth said, sadly. She's tired and hungry and it's all my fault. How is it your fault? Look, you're doing everything you can to keep her safe and to make her feel loved and wanted. And you don't need to worry about milk, I'll go get you some now. But where from? I live in a guest house on the edge of Murray Plains. I'll go back down to the ranch now and collect my horse. I'll ride home and gather up whatever you need and then be back before you know it. But what if Reed sees you? Then he'll just think I'm coming down from the plains, my day's work done. Don't worry, ma'am, I won't give you away. I don't know how to thank you, Jed, Elizabeth said, looking up gratefully. You don't need to thank me, ma'am. He smiled at her, wishing he could do or say something which would ease her worry. Elizabeth, call me Elizabeth, she said with a smile, and he thought his heart would burst with joy. Ever since he had first met her, he had never addressed her as anything other than ma'am. He'd just been too tongue-tied and nervous to do anything other. Elizabeth, he managed and nodded at her. He could hardly believe how good the word felt on his own tongue. And don't you worry now, I'll be back just as soon as I can. Thank you, Jed. As he set off at speed across the plains, Jed thought he would be back at the ranch in no time at all. He was running faster than he could ever remember running since he'd been a young boy, and he felt oddly exhilarated by it. If he was ever going to get to know Elizabeth Carter, it was now. Of course, he would not for one moment have wished her to suffer as she was doing simply so that he could find some common ground with which they could communicate. But he liked her so much he couldn't bear to see her so scared and sad, and would have done anything to help her, even if that meant breaking the law. That was, if any laws were truly broken. He had no idea, and, in truth, it wouldn't have changed a thing. Perhaps fate or the good Lord had brought them together. That baby certainly needed someone to love her if her mama wouldn't or couldn't, and Elizabeth certainly needed someone to look out for her now she had taken such a drastic step. If Jed could help her and, at the same time, let her know just how much he thought of her, then maybe that was meant to be. Maybe everything did, in the end, happen for a reason. Of course, only time would tell if that was true, and only the good Lord, in the end, could truly decide if everything would work out for the best. After all, if it did not, then there was much to lose. Not least of all his job at the ranch. Chapter 6. True to his word, Jed had returned carrying everything she would need. He brought so many blankets that she knew that she and the baby would be warm enough at least. And he had brought plenty of milk with him and matches to start a fire, and even a small pan to warm the milk in. She was pleased to see that he had brought the clean cloth that she had begged for so that she might feed the baby easily. In truth, of all the people she might have expected to see walking through the door of that barn, Jed had been the last of them. And if she was entirely honest with herself, she would never have suspected for a moment that he would have helped her and put his own job with her brother-in-law on the line. After all, in order to help her, he would have to lie to her family and his own boss. Not only that, but as much as she liked Jed, she thought he had nothing more than a passing interest in her. When she had first arrived with her sisters at the ranch, she had been so upset by events she could hardly think straight. Then, she saw Jed for the first time and had been strangely lifted by the sight of him. Most of the ranchers were older than Reed, who, already well into his 30s, was just about the right age for her older sister. The rest of the ranchers were simply too old for Elizabeth, and, shallow or not, she had liked the look of Jed Tolley the moment she had set eyes on him. And her little attraction to him gave her hope for the future. It was as if life really did go on. Since Jed was more or less water in the desert, she rather thought that her sisters might quite like the look of him also. But there was something quiet and reserved about him, and he seemed to slip beyond their notice somehow. Unless, of course, he was attractive to her in a way that he simply wasn't attractive to her sisters. Beauty was in the eye of the beholder, so perhaps handsomeness was also. Anyway, as the weeks had sailed by, she quickly realized that Jed wasn't at all interested in her. Whenever she tried to engage him in some way, he seemed awkward and very much as if he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. In the end, it had made her feel a little nervous also, and it was often the case that the two of them hardly spoke to one another at all. And so, when he had appeared suddenly, having followed her across the plains, no one could have been more surprised than Elzabeth. And when he'd said that he would help, she could hardly contain her gratitude and emotion. "I think that's everything," Jed said, kneeling in the straw and laying out everything he had brought from the guest house. "Where on earth did you get all that milk?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Well, I had a little myself. And then I pleaded with the landlady, saying I didn't have any and I could use some for a bedtime drink." "Your landlady gave in?" Elzabeth asked with a smile. "She sure did. I've been there a while and I'm one of her only boarders who behaves himself, so I've become her favorite." He grinned at her, and Elzabeth couldn't help but think that they suddenly seemed to have a little more in common. Perhaps breaking the law might even bring them closer together. "Well, it sure looks like being the favorite has its advantages." She smiled again. "And I really don't know how to thank you. I said before, there's no need." He smiled and looked down, reminding her of the awkwardness that ordinarily existed between them. "And anyway, you must be real hungry about now." "I really am. I didn't eat the bread and cheese. I just couldn't do it." She shook her head from side to side as she dipped the cloth into the milk once more and raised it to the baby's mouth. "I just couldn't feed myself until I knew that she'd had some milk in her little belly." "I guess that sounds kind of silly." "No, it doesn't sound silly at all. I reckon that baby is just about the luckiest baby in the world," he said, surprising her entirely. "How can she be? Even her own mama didn't want her." Elzabeth looked truly miserable. "Maybe not. But maybe she did," he said, and Elzabeth nodded in agreement. Either way, that baby ended up on a porch and was found by somebody who was prepared to do anything to keep her safe and make her happy. "If that ain't luck, you tell me what is," he said, and grinned at her. Every smile he had given her previously had always seemed to Elzabeth a little wary in some way. She had always assumed that he had, perhaps rightly, thought that she would be attracted to him, being one of the younger ranchers. In the end, she had simply come to the conclusion that he didn't want to become too friendly with her, in case she got the wrong idea. But now that he was smiling at her so openly, Elzabeth realized just what a handsome man Jed really was. He had tanned skin and light hair with hazel eyes that seemed to shine at her. And he was, as were most ranchers, fit and broad and strong. In the end, Elzabeth had to fight to remember what they had been talking about. "Well, I thank you for that, Jed." She regained a little composure. "I must admit, I'd feel a lot happier if I knew who this baby's mama was. Just to give her the chance to put things right and take her baby back. Well, I guess I could ask around. There are one or two gossips about the place. There's one in Murray Plains, a friend of my landlady, who always seems to be in the know. Maybe she's seen or heard something that might help. I could go tomorrow evening after work," he said, looking at her for confirmation that that was what she truly wanted. "It really seems like a lot for me to ask of you, but I just can't do it myself." "Would you? Would you really?" "Yes, of course I would. But Jed, you're going to be so tired." It's late now and you've got to get home, and then you've got to come back to the ranch tomorrow and work a full day before going back into town to track down this gossip of yours. Perhaps I really am asking too much. No, you're not asking too much. And as for me going home tonight, there's no chance about that, he said with confidence. Don't you worry, now. I'll make myself a little nest over there with what's left of the straw. However, I'm not leaving you and that baby here on your own on the edge of Martin Walsh's land. I wouldn't leave you anywhere, but here least of all. In truth, Elzabeth had never felt so relieved. The idea of staying in the old barn on her own with the baby had scared her more than she had realized. Maybe it was a little inappropriate for them to stay together, but Jed was certainly a gentleman and this seemed to be an appropriate time. At least with him here she would be safe, and so would her little charge. Chapter 7. Now, why would you be asking me about pregnant young ladies? Blanche Gorton, arguably the nosiest woman in all of Murray Plains, seemed to be taking the moral high ground for once. Just out of interest, really, Jed said, and, when the doughy-faced old woman wrinkled her nose at him, he thought again. I take it you haven't heard about the baby that was found on the porch over at Reed Masters' ranch then? Jed had not really wanted to part with the information so soon, but realized that he would have to come up with something if he was to get a little information in return. And in any case, once the sheriff started looking for the baby in earnest, Blanche would be as aware as everybody else. What baby? What are you talking about? Blanche's eyes shone with excitement, and Jed found suddenly that he didn't like her at all. In truth, he'd never been particularly keen on the woman, not liking gossips in general. He'd always thought that gossips couldn't help but add a little something to a tale before they passed it on, and in his opinion the little extra that they added was nearly always rather hurtful. However, seeing how pleased and excited she was at the prospect of a story involving a young child being abandoned, Jed thought that he quite detested her. Just yesterday morning, Mrs. Gorton, somebody left a newborn baby on the porch at Reed Masters' ranch house. They're trying to find out who the baby's mother might be, and I just thought that you might have some idea. Why would I have any idea? She asked, riding high on her dignity once more. Jed had to bite his tongue to refrain from telling her that if anybody would have pertinent information, it would probably be the nosiest woman for several towns across. Instead, he simply smiled and shrugged. I don't know, you just always seem to care enough to take notice, he said, quite unable to believe that he had come up with such a line. Well, ain't that the truth? Folks just don't care these days, she said, instantly warming to the theme he had created. And you know, there was a little lady here, just on the edge of town, with a swollen belly and no sign of a willing daddy anywhere. Once again, Blanche Gorton was a little too gleeful for his liking. Just lately? He asked hopefully. Oh yes, in fact, I thought she left town. I haven't seen her for maybe a week now. And she was big enough, close to term I reckon. Her eyebrows were raised high. So, do you reckon she could have birthed that baby on her own and left it on the doorstep? Well, if there was no daddy around, she might have felt she had no choice, Jed said, trying to appeal to the woman's sense of decency. And maybe, just maybe, she should have thought of it all before she got started on that kind of a life. Blanche Gorton sniffed and lifted her head high in a curiously proud fashion. Well, I guess we are all wise after the event, huh? Jed said, trying to rein in his irritation. But tell me, Mrs. Gorton, what was the girl's name? Mary Fraser, I think, she said, then squinting, she looked into the distance, almost as if the girl's name could be found there. It was certainly Mary, at any rate. Was she local? No, she lived here for a while. I reckon she just came here out of the way while she had that baby of hers. I never knew anything about her beforehand. And that man of hers, he looked, she shuddered. Well, just about as rough as they get. Man of hers? Jed said, his eyebrows raised. I thought you said that there was no daddy for that baby. Well, he didn't stick around. But I reckon he was the one. Blanche Gorton crossed her arms over her heavy bust and looked entirely self-satisfied. And he looked rough, did he? Rough enough that she looked scared when I saw them together. And does he live here in Murray Plains? No, I only ever saw him a couple of times. But Ned, who has the saloon bar, reckons he knows him. Garrett's somebody or other. A real nasty piece of work. Daddy or not, that girl's probably better off without him. Mrs. Gorton, where in Murray Plains did Mary live? Belle Gardner's place. The roughest guest house in all of Idaho, I reckon, she said with a sneer. Well, I guess the girl had to rest her head somewhere. I guess so. Blanche Gorton said with a judgmental shrug. That's the sort of place for such women. Jed bit down hard on the words that he wanted to lash out at Blanche. He knew it would do no good and maybe he might need her help to save another innocent down the line. Just in case, he would let her think that he agreed, even though it curled his toes to hear such hate spouted at those less fortunate. Well, thank you for your time. He rose to his feet and nodded at her before putting his hat back on. You're welcome, young man, she said and suddenly smiled at him in a manner he could only have described as garish. You see you come back now, do you hear? I'd like to know how this story ends, she said gleefully. The information notwithstanding, he wished he'd never set eyes on her in all his life. As far as Jed was concerned, Blanche Gorton was a vulture of a woman. Chapter 8. Don't reckon I've seen you here before, sweetheart, Belle Gardner said as she leaned in towards him. Jed had known well that Belle Gardner's place was one in which a man could get a little more than a good night's sleep if that was what he wanted. However, he'd never been particularly interested, and certainly not interested enough to ever visit the place. But a person didn't need to be as nosy and as gossiping as Blanche Gorton to know that the place certainly had a seedy side. As for Belle Gardner, she was easily old enough to be Jed's mother and he hoped that he would be able to get their conversation over and done with as quickly as possible. No, I've never been here before, Miss Gardner, Jed said politely. But I could really use your help. Whatever you need, she said with a wink, almost bearing down on him. Actually, Miss Gardner, it was information I was looking for. I'm looking for someone, you see. Oh, yes, she said, and suddenly snapped upright, standing so straight he realized just how tall a woman she was. Are you now? She went on, and it was clear that she was now rather suspicious of him. Yes, I'm looking for a young woman called Mary. Mary Fraser, maybe. You're looking for a woman and you don't even know her name? Belle said, and folded her arms defensively. That's right, Jed said honestly. I'm certain her name is Mary though, even if it isn't Fraser. And why would you think that I would know this Mary Fraser? Because I reckon she stayed here for a while, Jed said and tried to hold the woman's steely gaze. You know, I run a thriving little business here in Murray Plains, young man, and do you know why? Jed didn't respond but simply shook his head. Because I know when to keep my mouth shut, she said, and suddenly lost whatever little allure she may have had in the first place. At that moment, Belle Gardner had become extraordinarily hard-faced and really quite manly in appearance. Perhaps it was simply her aggressive stance. Well, I'm not really sure why it is you're just so suspicious of me, but perhaps if I tell you why I'm looking for Mary you might change your mind, Jed began. At some point in the last day or two, Mary's had that baby of hers. I don't know where she was when she gave birth. All I know is that she left her baby on the front porch of Reed Masters' ranch house. The thing is, we're all real worried about Mary now. If she was out there on her own giving birth to that baby, there's no telling what state she's in. Oh, my good Lord, Belle Gardner said, and suddenly Jed felt sorry for her. He could tell just by looking at her that she must have cared a good deal for Mary and was as worried for her as she was suspicious of him. Miss Gardner, do you have any idea where Mary is now? She really did it? She really left her baby on someone's front porch? I guess she didn't think she had any choice. I guess she didn't, Belle Gardner said, and her eyes began to fill up with tears. And I reckon that's my fault. Why? Why is it your fault? Jed asked, thinking that they were getting somewhere at last. Because I didn't want her to have that baby here. I didn't want Garrett Darnley coming back in this place and realizing that the child was his. He'd blame me, you see, for not making her get rid of it. What? Jed exclaimed, his eyes wide. Oh, don't look like that. You might be a church on Sunday kind of a person, but I'm not. Life has dealt me one too many hard knocks for that, she said, snapping at him viciously. I didn't mean anything by it, Miss Gardner, forgive me, he said and smiled at her. In truth, he cared very little for the feelings of Belle Gardner. He simply didn't want her to clam up now that he was getting close to finding something out. Well, you just watch how you look at me, she said, still angry. Miss Gardner, did Garrett Darnley not realize that Mary was pregnant? Even if he had, he wouldn't have necessarily thought the kid was his. She shrugged expansively and suddenly the penny dropped. Oh, so, Mary wasn't just staying here, was she? She was working here. That's right, Belle said with a challenging stare. She was a nice girl, but she didn't have a lot of choices in life. Much like me back in the old days. And Garrett Darnley was one of her visitors? In the end, he was the only visitor. Mary just didn't have it in her to let a different man into her bed night after night. She didn't like Garrett, but I think she had it in her head that if it was only him, then it wasn't so bad. She didn't make much money, but she made enough. So, Garrett would suspect that he was the child's father, surely? Gossip travels fast in a little town like this. One of the girls would let something slip sooner or later. The very minute he finds out that he was her one and only customer, Garrett is going to know that he is that baby's daddy. And I wouldn't want to be there when he finds out. Chapter 9. Although Elizabeth had to spend a good part of the day by herself, she had begun to look forward to Jed arriving in the early evening to stay with her. He always brought more food and milk with him and, although it had only been a few days, Elizabeth had found herself coming to depend on him. Not only that, but she had found herself coming to like him more and more. He was no longer the handsome rancher. The only man on her brother-in-law's ranch young enough to draw her notice. Now he had become her friend and they had talked and shared confidences in a way that they might never have done otherwise. And are they absolutely sure it's Mary Fraser? Elizabeth asked, feeling her heart breaking for a young woman she had never met. The ranchers are all talking about it. Reed Masters told Gus Martin personally, and Gus told the rest of us. It looks like the sheriff has made some similar inquiries to the ones I made with Belle Gardner, but with an armload of deputies at his disposal, they were able to search the area real quick. Where did they find her? She was tucked away in the undergrowth on the west side of the ranch, only an hour's walk from the ranch house, maybe. And when did she die? What happened? Elizabeth asked, feeling her words sticking in her throat. As they spoke, she cradled Mary Fraser's baby in her arms, wishing that life could have been just a little kinder to the young woman and her child. Now, the baby would end up in an orphanage for sure, and all her efforts would have been in vain. I don't know exactly, but apparently, the sheriff said that Doc reckoned she'd had a real tough birth. She was probably trying to get back into town when she became too ill to keep going. Jed reached out and cupped her face in his hand. Hey, Elizabeth, he said, trying to soothe her, only, it was not good. Such a sad and terrible end to someone's life was too much to hear. Gently she cried. What an awful thing to happen, she said, her words coming out in choked little sobs. For such a young woman to lose her life like that. And her last moments spent grieving for the child she'd had to give away. What a cruel and awful world this is. And now this beautiful little baby is going to grow up in an orphanage. There was never any sense in what I did, was there? Yes, there was. You did the right thing, whatever the outcome. Jed had moved to sit at her side and put his arm around her. I reckon you're just about the most wonderful woman I ever met, he said, and kissed the top of the head. And the most stupid, she said miserably. My poor sisters must be distraught with worry, and it will all end up for nothing. No, I won't hear you say that. Not with the way I feel about you, he said, and pulled her to him. I told your sisters that a woman came to me and told them you were safe. That you would come back soon, but that you just needed some time. I know it was wrong, but I also knew you did not want them to worry. You are such a wonderful man. I am so grateful, she said and sobbed against his shoulder. I would do anything for you, he said, I always would. I always thought you didn't like me very much, Elizabeth said. Feeling a little better, she sat up a little and gently rubbed the baby's cheek. With such wonderful sentiments coming from Jed, she felt entirely unable to look up at the handsome man who had his arm around her. Well, that's funny, he said and chuckled. You see, all these weeks, that's what I thought you felt about me. And then, every time I saw you, I'd just get so tongue-tied and feel like a fool that I couldn't really say much. I wish I'd known, Elizabeth said and turned to look up at him shyly. Because I felt just the same. I thought you must have a girl of your own already and that you wouldn't be interested in me. No, there's no girl, he said and reached out to stroke the baby's cheek also. And there's never been a girl I think about all the time the way I do you. Oh, Jed, what am I going to do? I guess it would be best now if you went home. Go back down to your sisters and read. Despite what I told them, they are all worried about you and they really want you to come home. You're probably right, Jed. After all, I can't hide out here with her forever. That's no better life than one in the orphanage in the end, is it? Running is too hard a life for anybody, and probably impossible with such a tiny baby. He kissed the top of her head again. I just want one more night with her, Elizabeth said, tears flowing freely down her face now that she knew that her time as the guardian of that beautiful baby was drawing to an end. Will you stay? Just one more night with us? Of course I will, he said, and smiled at her. I just hope that, as she grows up, she has even the smallest notion of a time when she was loved and cradled all night by the woman who found her on the front porch. I know that won't really happen, but it's a nice thing to wish for, right? Who knows what we remember from being babies? We probably do remember stuff like that, love and caring and all the important things, without knowing quite where we remember them from. Maybe we don't even remember who it was that gave us that love and caring. I guess the important thing is to have the feeling that you know that somebody did, if only once. How on earth is it that somebody who speaks as beautifully as you do finds himself tongue-tied?" Elzabeth asked, laughing bravely through her tears. "Ah, well, you see, I always stutter in the face of real beauty," he said, and reached out to tuck a stray strand of thick chestnut hair behind her ear. Chapter 10. Jed had turned up for work as normal in the morning. Elzabeth had made it very clear that she did not want his part in things to be known. After all, it seemed that she thought a great deal of him, and she certainly didn't want to see him lose his place at the ranch for admitting his part in keeping Elzabeth and the baby hidden. However, as he walked his own horse towards the stables to get her a drink, Jed realized that something was going on. Gus Martin was pacing up and down just outside the ranch house, a look of real consternation on his face. "Hey Gus, what's happening?" Jed asked, feeling sure it had something to do with Elzabeth and the baby. "Some big old troublemakers just shown up accusing Reed and Victoria of stealing his child." "Oh, my God," Jed said, trying to get close enough to look in through the windows. "What are you doing?" Gus said, looking at him wide-eyed and spreading his arms. "Just making sure that the boss is all right in there," Jed said truthfully. After all, Garrett Darnley was, as Blanche Gorton had put it, a nasty piece of work. And if the hard-faced Belle Gardner was afraid of the man, then he really had to be no good. "Well, you better hope you find that sister of yours before I do." Garrett roared as the door to the ranch house flew open and he strode out through it. "Don't you dare lay a hand on my sister," Victoria called, a look of fear and fury on her face. "Best you start looking is all I can say." Garrett pushed past Gus quite unnecessarily before climbing back onto his own horse. "And best you start looking now." And with that, he turned and rode off. Jed knew that he had to do something. Elzabeth was due to walk back down from the barn with the baby in an hour or so, and, if Garrett rode off in the right direction, he would undoubtedly see her. "Boss, I know where Elzabeth is," Jed said, doing his best to ignore the stunned look of Victoria Masters. "What? What are you talking about?" Reed asked, looking dumbfounded. "I'm sorry, boss, I just couldn't leave her on her own. Elzabeth overheard the two of you talking about the baby going into an orphanage and she couldn't bear it. She just wanted to hide out until the baby's mama could be found." "But the baby's mother is dead," Victoria said, her eyes filling with tears. "Elzabeth knows that now and she's coming back down home today. She should be setting off any minute and I don't want her coming face to face with Garrett Darnley." "Right, where is she?" Reed asked, before looking at Gus. "Gus, can you round up the men and have them meet us here?" Gus climbed back onto his horse without a word and set off. "So?" Reed asked, glaring at Jed. "She was staying in the old barn on the very edge of your land, boss. Just before the disputed land at the border with Martin Walsh's place." "And why the hell didn't you tell me?" "Stop, Reed," Victoria said, earnestly. "He either had to offend you or hurt her. He didn't have much of a choice, did he? And at least he kept her safe." She looked up at Jed thankfully. "And that's exactly what I'm going to do now," he said, quickly getting back onto his horse and heading off to find Elzabeth. Although Jed knew that the rest of the ranch hands would be there very soon, when he saw Garrett's horse tethered outside the old barn, he felt his mouth go dry. However, he wasted no time jumping down from his own horse and running straight into the barn to find her. "Jed, thank God," Elzabeth said, holding the baby tightly to her. "I had to run all the way back here with this awful man chasing me on horseback." She looked at Darnley accusingly. "I'm awful, am I? I just want my baby back." "And where were you, when this baby was being born? Jed asked, knowing that they couldn't possibly hand the child over to the man, and yet, knowing better still, that by law they might have to. How was I to know that the kid was mine? How was I to know that I was Mary's only customer? And how exactly did you find that out? Jed asked, hoping that he wasn't about to hear that Belle Gardner had let Mary down again. One of Belle's girls told me. You give them enough gin, they'll tell you anything, he said with a sneer. So, why don't you tell me why it is a man like you, who spends his time and money in Belle Gardner's place, is fit to bring up this baby girl? Jed said, holding his ground and feeling sure that he would have to fight at any moment. Baby girl? Garrett Darnley seemed confused. I thought it was a boy. No, your child is a girl, Elizabeth almost spat the words at him. Well, some girl ain't no good to me. I thought had a son, someone to take after me. What an inheritance, indeed, Elizabeth said, and Jed almost laughed at her wit. Well, there's nobody can say that child is mine. The whole town knows what Mary Fraser did for a living. There ain't no way you're pinning that baby on me. Garrett seemed suddenly so wrong-footed that he was no longer such a formidable sight. Well, I guess you'll be on your way then, Jed said levelly. Yep, I reckon that's for the best. Suddenly, Reed and the rest of the ranchers appeared. Without a word, Garrett walked out of the barn. He didn't even look at his baby daughter as he went. And, in truth, Jed knew that if he had decided to take that baby, there would have been nothing that he or anyone else present could have done. The man really was a nasty piece of work. Thank you, Jed. Suddenly, Elizabeth was at his side. Thank you for coming to rescue me. She smiled up at him. Jed took her into his arms and pulled her close. Lifting her chin, he did what was probably the stupidest thing he could. He kissed her. Elizabeth melted against him before kissing him back. Jed pulled back, expecting his boss to be ready to punch him for such a liberty, but nothing happened. Quickly, he lifted Elizabeth's chin again. I love you, he said as he looked into her eyes. I love you so much and I want to marry you. Will you marry me, please? Yes, she said, and they hugged tightly with the baby between them. Epilogue. They were married so fast that Elizabeth was surprised how many people came to the wedding. She had truly thought that the folk of Murray Plains might have wanted a bit more notice of the event. However, the ranch house was packed with well-wishers for the wedding feast, and it was not long before Elizabeth realized that most of them had truly wanted to hear all the ins and outs of the big excitement on the day Garrett Darnley had gone looking for her. I reckon Mary will be smiling down on you this day. Belle Gardner had been a most unexpected wedding guest. Taking on her baby and all like you're doing. I guess you did her proud when the rest of us just let her down. Belle smiled sadly. We'll raise little Mary just like our own, Elizabeth assured Belle. We sure will. Jed put his arm around Elizabeth and smiled at Belle. That is so sweet, calling her Mary, and I reckon her ma would be pretty proud, Belle said. I've wanted to give her a name since the moment I picked her up, only nothing seemed right until I heard Mary. Now it seems perfect. I hear you're doing up that old barn you were hiding out in, Belle said. That's romantic even to an old girl like me who thought she'd seen it all. Well, I reckon Reed will be relieved. Elizabeth laughed. One less sister to worry about. So, who's next? Belle laughed again as Elizabeth looked across the room at Gabriella. As pleased as Gabriella was to be at her sister's wedding, she was much less pleased to find herself in the company of Hunter Logan. Elizabeth smiled. They'd work it out. Thank you for listening to the second book in author Indiana Wake's the Carter Sisters series. If you enjoyed A Baby on the Porch, you'll love the third book, Captured by the Rancher. Subscribe to Indiana's YouTube channel today and be the first to know when she releases new free audiobooks.